The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the kitchen, a low, indifferent thrum that usually faded into the background of our lives. But this morning, it was a roaring beast, amplifying the silence that had just crashed down around me. My phone, still clutched in my hand, felt like a block of ice. The numbers on the screen swam, a cruel, mocking dance.
0.
A whole string of them after a decimal point, where once there had been everything. Our everything. The coffee cup slipped from my other hand, shattering on the ceramic tiles. Brown liquid, dark as despair, spread like a stain across the floor, mimicking the stains spreading across my heart, across my life. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look down. My gaze was fixed on some invisible point beyond the kitchen wall, a point where my future had just vanished.
Gone.
Transferred. Wiped clean by the man who had promised to build that future with me. The air rushed out of my lungs, a silent scream I couldn't voice. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But the bank notification, cold and impersonal, didn't lie. If you've ever had the ground beneath your feet turn to quicksand, if you've ever felt that sickening lurch of betrayal that steals your breath, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're new here, please subscribe. Knowing you're listening, it means more than you can imagine. Our life, or what I had believed to be our life, was built on a foundation of shared dreams and meticulously saved pennies. 15 years. 15 years of careful planning, of skipped luxuries, of quiet evenings spent budgeting instead of splurging. Mark had always been the more cautious one with money, or so I thought. He'd pore over spreadsheets, his brow furrowed in concentration, and I'd feel a sense of security, a naive pride in his diligence. For our future, he'd say, tapping a column of figures. For that little place by the coast. For early retirement. For us. I'd smile, tracing the lines on his hand, believing every word. Our future. It sounded so solid, so tangible, like the warm weight of his arm around me at night. We weren't extravagant people. Our joy came from simple things. Long walks in the park, the smell of freshly baked bread on a Sunday morning, the comfortable silences that spoke of deep understanding. Or so I believed. The us he spoke of, I now realized, was a carefully constructed lie, a stage set for a play in which I was an unwitting actor. The money was more than just currency. It was crystallized time. It was the echo of my laughter when he'd suggested putting an extra $50 away each week, the warmth of my hand in his as we'd walked past the travel agency, dreaming of Tuscan vineyards. It was the silent agreement that we were a team, building something lasting. Now, that shared history felt like a counterfeit coin, shiny on the surface, but worthless underneath. The house we lived in, a modest suburban 3-bedroom, felt like a mausoleum of those dreams. Every photograph on the mantelpiece, every souvenir from a past vacation, every piece of furniture we'd chosen together, they all seemed to mock me. His side of the closet, still filled with his clothes, his scent faintly lingering in the fabric. The indentation on his pillow, a hollow where his head used to rest. It was all a testament to a life I no longer recognized, a life that had been systematically hollowed out from the inside. I remember the little things. The way he'd started working late more often, the texts he'd angle away from me, the vague explanations for unexplained charges on the credit card, charges I dismissed as him perhaps buying me a surprise, or a new gadget for himself. Oh, the naivety stings more than the malice sometimes. I'd chalked it up to stress, to ambition. I'd made excuses for him, papering over the cracks that were beginning to show in our foundation, too afraid to look too closely, too afraid of what I might find. Fear is a powerful sedative. The life savings account. It was our sacred cow, the untouchable sum designated for the big things, the real things. We both had access, of course, but the understanding, unspoken yet ironclad, was that any significant withdrawal would be a joint decision, a conversation, a shared step. The very idea of one of us emptying it without the other, it was unthinkable. It was a violation of trust so profound it bordered on the surreal. Yet there it was in stark black and white on my banking app. Transferred. Destination unknown. At least to me. But a cold certainty was already forming in the pit of my stomach. I knew, with a primal instinct that bypassed logic, that this wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate act of destruction. The notification had arrived innocuously enough. A standard alert from the bank. A large transaction has been processed on your joint savings account. I'd frowned, thinking perhaps it was a scheduled investment maturity, something Mark had set up and forgotten to mention in detail. He handled the bulk of the serious finances after all. I'd opened the app with a casual flick of my thumb, my mind already on the grocery list for the week. And then the world tilted. The numbers, or rather, the lack of them, punched the air from my lungs. It wasn't a partial withdrawal. It was everything. Every cent, years of sacrifice, of dreams deferred, gone in a single, brutal transaction. The name of the recipient wasn't listed, just an account number and a bank I didn't recognize. But the sheer audacity of it, the totality of the erasure, pointed to something more than a financial mishap. It felt personal. It felt like an annihilation. My first coherent thought, after the initial wave of shock, was denial. A hack. It had to be a hack. Someone had breached our security. I fumbled for Mark's number, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely press the digits. He didn't answer. Straight to voicemail. Mark, call me immediately. Something's happened with the bank. I think we've been hacked. My voice was thin, reedy, a stranger's voice. I paced the kitchen, the shattered cup forgotten. Again and again I called him. Voicemail. 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 The knot of dread in my stomach tightened with each unanswered call. Hackers don't usually call ahead to announce their intentions. Hackers don't usually have the intimate knowledge of your financial vulnerabilities. This felt targeted. This felt intimate. Then came the email. I almost missed it, amidst the frantic refreshing of my banking app. The subject line was deceptively simple. Some things you should know. It wasn't from Mark. It was from an unfamiliar address. My blood ran cold. With trembling hands, I opened it. There were no words, just an attachment. A photograph. Mark. And a woman. Not just any woman. A woman I'd seen before, a colleague of his from a department I barely knew. They were laughing, heads close together, a champagne flute in her hand, his arm possessively around her waist. They were on a beach, a tropical, sun-drenched beach that looked suspiciously like the brochures we'd once looked at for our someday trip. But this wasn't someday. This was clearly recent. And I wasn't in the picture. The pieces slammed together with brutal force. The late nights. The secretive texts. The vague credit card charges. The sudden, inexplicable emptying of our life savings. It wasn't a hack. It was a heist. A meticulously planned betrayal, executed by the man I had trusted with my life, with our future. He hadn't just stolen our money. He had stolen our past, rewriting it as a lie. He had stolen my present, leaving me in the ruins. And he had tried to steal my future, leaving me with nothing but ashes. The silence in the kitchen was no longer just the hum of the refrigerator. It was the roar of my world collapsing. The coffee stain on the floor seemed to spread, wider and wider, until it threatened to engulf me. I sank to my knees, the shards of the broken cup digging into my skin, but I felt nothing. Nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness where my heart used to be. He had left me with nothing, or so he thought. The first few days were a blur of numb disbelief. I moved through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects that now felt alien. His side of the bed remained undisturbed, a cold, empty space that mocked my loneliness. I replayed every conversation, every shared glance, searching for clues I must have missed, for the moment the script of our lives had diverged so drastically from the one I was reading. Had it all been a lie? Every I love you, every shared dream, every quiet moment of intimacy? The thought was a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundations of my sanity. I tried calling him again, dozens of times. Each call went straight to voicemail, his cheerful, recorded greeting a cruel parody of the man I thought I knew. "Hi, you've reached Mark. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you. Get back to me?" He'd already delivered his message, loud and clear, in the form of a zero balance and a photograph designed to inflict maximum pain. The email with the picture, it was from her. Her name, I vaguely recalled, was Clarissa. Young, ambitious, with a predatory gleam in her eyes I'd once dismissed as youthful confidence. Now I saw it for what it was. The email address was a throwaway, untraceable. The act itself was pure malice, a deliberate twisting of the knife. Not content with taking my husband and my money, she wanted to ensure I knew, in excruciating detail, how thoroughly I had been deceived. Sleep was a battlefield I rarely won. When I did drift off, nightmares plagued me. Images of Mark and Clarissa laughing, spending our money, living the life that was supposed to have been ours. I'd wake up gasping, my heart pounding, the sheets twisted around me like a shroud. During the day, a suffocating anxiety pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, to think. The future, once a brightly lit path, was now a terrifying, dark void. How would I pay the mortgage? The bills? What would I do? He had handled most of the major finances, lulling me into a false sense of security. Now, I was adrift, with no anchor and no shore in sight. Friends called, concerned by my silence. I offered vague excuses, mumbled about a bad flu. How could I articulate the enormity of the betrayal? How could I admit that the life I had so carefully curated, the life I had proudly presented to the world, was a sham? The shame was a heavy cloak, suffocating me. One afternoon, staring blankly at the bank statement that confirmed the devastating truth, a flicker of something other than despair sparked within me. Anger. A cold, hard knot of fury began to form in the pit of my stomach. He wouldn't get away with this. They wouldn't. This wasn't just about the money. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming some small piece of my dignity from the wreckage. I started small. I gathered every financial document I could find, old statements, loan agreements, investment portfolios. I meticulously went through years of credit card bills, highlighting unfamiliar charges, cross-referencing dates with Mark's increasingly frequent business trips. A pattern began to emerge, a trail of deceit woven through the mundane transactions of our lives. Dinners for two at expensive restaurants I'd never been to. Hotel bookings in cities he had no legitimate reason to visit. Jewelry purchases that were certainly not for me. Each discovery was a fresh stab, but it also fueled the growing fire within me. The sheer premeditation was what struck me most. This wasn't a sudden, impulsive act. This was a calculated campaign of deception, likely spanning months, if not years. He had looked me in the eye, day after day, while systematically dismantling our life, our future for her. The photograph. I kept coming back to it. Clarissa's triumphant smirk. Mark's arm around her, proprietary, possessive. It was designed to break me, to leave me a crumpled heap of despair. And it almost had. But now it served a different purpose. It was a reminder of what I was fighting against. It was a catalyst. I remembered a conversation with a friend, years ago, who had gone through a messy divorce. "Get a shark, Em," she'd said. "Don't try to be nice. When it comes to this, nice gets you nowhere." At the time, I'd pitted her cynicism. Now, her words echoed in my mind with newfound clarity. The challenges were immense. The joint account, by its very nature, meant he had a legal right to access the funds. Proving malicious intent, proving that this was part of a deliberate plan to defraud me, would be difficult. The money was already gone, transferred to an account I couldn't identify, possibly already being spent. The legal fees alone would be crippling, especially now that I had access to virtually nothing. Mark, it turned out, wasn't just deceitful. He was thorough. He had likely consulted his own legal counsel, planned his exit strategy with meticulous care. He would have anticipated my shock, my grief, perhaps even banking on it to paralyze me into inaction. He probably imagined me crying for weeks, too devastated to fight back until it was too late, until the money was untraceable, irretrievable. The sheer scale of the betrayal began to hit me in waves. It wasn't just the money for our coastal cottage or early retirement. It was money earmarked for property taxes, for insurance, for the emergency fund we'd painstakingly built. He hadn't just stolen our dreams. He'd jeopardized my immediate survival, my ability to keep a roof over my head. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I found myself oscillating between moments of furious energy, where I'd spend hours sifting through paperwork, and moments of crushing despair, where the weight of it all threatened to drown me. Friends, when I finally confided in a select few, offered sympathy, outrage, and well-meaning but often impractical advice. "You should just forget him," one said.
"Move on.
"He's not worth it." Easy to say, when your life savings hadn't just boarded a plane to paradise with your husband and his mistress. The deepest fear was that he had already won, that the money was beyond reach, spirited away to offshore accounts or already converted into untraceable assets. Clarissa's smug face in that photograph seemed to confirm it. They were celebrating their victory, while I was left picking through the ruins. One evening, I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by piles of documents, the silence of the empty house pressing in on me. I felt so utterly alone, so comprehensively defeated. Tears streamed down my face, hot and furious.
Was this it?
Was this how my story ended? A victim, conned and abandoned? The thought was unbearable. And then something shifted. It wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration, but a slow, dawning realization. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to be weak. Clarissa expected me to be a forgotten casualty. Their arrogance was their Achilles heel. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness, my trust for naivety. Perhaps it had been for a time, but not anymore. The grief was still there, a raw, open wound. But beneath it, a new feeling was taking root, a cold, clear determination. I wouldn't just survive this. I would fight. And I would not fight fair because they hadn't. I would use every weapon at my disposal. The image of that coastal cottage, the dream he had so callously incinerated, flashed in my mind. He wasn't just going to pay for what he'd done. He was going to understand, viscerally, what it felt like to have the ground crumble beneath his feet. I picked up the phone. Not to call Mark. Not to cry to a friend. I called the number my divorced friend had given me all those years ago. The shark. It was time to go hunting. The first meeting with Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, was in a sterile, intimidating office that smelled of old books and expensive coffee. He was a man whose sharp suit seemed to be an extension of his sharper mind. He listened patiently, his face impassive, as I laid out the sordid tale, my voice surprisingly steady. I presented the bank statements, the credit card bills I'd highlighted, the infamous email with the photograph. I expected skepticism, perhaps even a touch of pity. Instead, I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, professional interest, the look of a predator sighting its prey. He was thorough, Mr. Henderson conceded, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the bank transfer confirmation. Moving that amount of money quickly, especially from a joint account, and then disappearing, he clearly had a plan. "So, it's hopeless?" I asked, the familiar dread creeping back. "Hopeless, Mrs. Davies?" "Not at all." A thin smile touched his lips. "Men like your husband, they're often arrogant. They believe they've covered all their tracks. But there are always tracks. And banks, especially when prompted correctly, have procedures. Strict ones." He explained the complexities. The difficulty of clawing back funds already transferred, especially if they'd moved quickly through multiple accounts, possibly offshore. But he also spoke of things like fraudulent conveyance, breach of fiduciary duty within a marriage, and the power of swift, decisive legal intervention. He mentioned something about the cooling-off period for large electronic transfers, a small window of opportunity that might still be open, depending on the exact timing and the bank's internal policies. "The key," he said, leaning forward, "is speed and precision. We need to act before that money settles, before it becomes truly untraceable." And we need to give the bank a very compelling reason to scrutinize this particular transaction with extreme prejudice. A sliver of hope, fragile but persistent, began to pierce through my despair. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. Mr. Henderson outlined a strategy. It was aggressive, bold, and frankly, terrifying. It involved direct communication with the bank's fraud department, leveraging every piece of evidence of Mark's deception, and painting a clear picture of a man absconding with marital assets in anticipation of abandoning his spouse. "He thinks he's on vacation," Mr. Henderson said, a glint in his eye. "We need to ensure it's the shortest, most unpleasant vacation of his life." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I provided Mr. Henderson with every detail I could recall, every piece of paper, every suspicion. He and his team worked with a speed and intensity that was both exhilarating and daunting. Affidavits were drafted, evidence compiled, timelines meticulously reconstructed. The focus was narrow: the transfer. Freezing it, or at least flagging it so intensely that it couldn't be easily accessed or moved further, was paramount. The weight of it all was immense. There were moments when doubt gnawed at me. What if Mark had been too clever? What if the money was already gone, converted into diamonds in Amsterdam, or fueling a speedboat in the Caribbean? What if this expensive legal battle was just throwing good money after bad money I no longer had? Mr. Henderson was a rock. "Focus on the objective, Mrs. Davies," he'd say calmly during my more panicked calls. "Let us handle the mechanics. Your husband made a mistake. He assumed you would break. He assumed you wouldn't fight back intelligently. We are going to prove him wrong." The strategy hinged on not just claiming the money was stolen, but demonstrating a pattern of behavior, a deliberate intent to deceive and defraud, leading up to the transfer. The emails, the credit card statements showing his secret life, the suddenness and completeness of the withdrawal, it all painted a picture. It wasn't just a spouse taking marital funds, it was a carefully orchestrated heist. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson called. "We're ready," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undercurrent of something that sounded like anticipation. "We have a contact at the transferring bank, someone high up in their fraud prevention unit. We believe we have enough to compel them to put an immediate administrative hold on the funds, pending investigation. It's not a guarantee the money will be returned, not yet. But it will stop him in his tracks. It will freeze him out. Freeze him out." The words echoed in my mind. The delicious irony of it. He had tried to leave me with nothing, to freeze me out of my own life. Now, the tables were about to be turned. The hours leading up to the planned call to the bank were the longest of my life. I paced my living room, the same space where I had collapsed in despair just weeks earlier. But now, the despair was overlaid with a nervous, almost giddy energy. It was the eve of battle, the moment before the charge. Mr. Henderson had advised me not to be present for the call itself. "It's better handled lawyer to lawyer or lawyer to bank executive. Keeps the emotion out of it, makes it purely a matter of procedure and legal obligation for them, but he promised to call me the instant he had news." I imagined Mark and Clarissa, wherever they were, lounging by a pool, perhaps clinking champagne glasses, laughing at my expense. Oblivious, confident in their victory. The thought fueled my resolve. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about accountability. This was about the look on his face when he realized his grand escape had hit a very solid, very expensive brick wall. The waiting was agony. Every passing minute stretched into an eternity. I replayed Mr. Henderson's words. It will stop him in his tracks. I clung to that phrase like a lifeline. I imagined the phone in Mark's hand, the casual swipe to check his new, flush bank balance, the dawning horror as he saw not the millions he expected, but a cold, stark notice. Account frozen. Then my phone rang. Mr. Henderson's name flashed on the screen. My heart leaped into my throat. I snatched it up, my hand trembling. "Emily," he said, and I noted the use of my first name, a subtle shift. "It's done, done," I whispered, afraid to hope too much. "The head of their international fraud unit was receptive," Mr. Henderson said, a hint of dry satisfaction in his voice. We presented our case. The timing of the transfer, the supporting evidence of Mr. Hughes's extracurricular activities and sudden departure, the sheer size of the sum relative to your known assets. They agreed the circumstances were highly suspicious. They've placed an immediate, non-negotiable freeze on the recipient account. I sank onto the sofa, a wave of dizziness washing over me. Frozen? So, he can't touch it. Not a penny, Mr. Henderson confirmed. Not until a full investigation is complete, and likely, not until a court order dictates its disposition. Which, given the circumstances, will almost certainly involve its return to the marital estate. Pending your divorce settlement, he paused, then added, it seems Mr. Hughes was in the process of attempting a further transfer to yet another account, possibly one more difficult to trace, when the freeze hit. He was, by all accounts, cut off mid-stride. Cut off mid-stride. A giddy, almost hysterical laugh bubbled up from my chest. Oh, the beautiful, poetic justice of it. He was probably, at that very moment, staring at a screen, his grand plans turning to dust. What happens now? I asked, my voice still shaky, but a new strength flowing through me. Now, Mr. Henderson said, we wait for Mr. Hughes to realize he can no longer fund his new life. We wait for him to contact us, or more likely, his own lawyer, in a state of considerable distress. And then, Mrs. Davies, we negotiate from a position of power. Power. It was a word I hadn't associated with myself for a very long time. But as I sat there in my quiet living room, I felt it. A cold, hard certainty. I had faced the abyss, and I hadn't fallen. I had fought back, and I had landed the first decisive blow. The call, when it came, was not from Mark. It was from a panicked, shrill-voiced Clarissa. It was a few days later. I almost didn't answer the unknown number, but a gut feeling, honed by weeks of suspicion, made me pick up. Where is he? What have you done? She shrieked, no preamble, no courtesy. Her voice, so confident and mocking in my imagination, was now laced with an ugly, raw panic. I paused, savoring the moment. Clarissa, I presume? I kept my voice calm, almost detached. To whom are you referring? And what makes you think I've done anything? Mark. Mark Hughes, your husband. Or soon-to-be ex-husband. Thanks to you, she spat. The money. It's gone. The account is frozen. He's going crazy. He's screaming. He says it's your fault. He's screaming. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I pictured it. Mark, the cool, collected planner, the meticulous thief, reduced to a screaming, impotent mess. The image was deeply, profoundly satisfying. Is it my fault, Clarissa? I asked softly. Or is it perhaps the consequence of attempting to steal a lifetime of savings to fund a tawdry affair? Banks tend to frown upon that sort of thing, you know. Especially when alerted by competent legal counsel. There was a sputtering sound on the other end of the line. You bitch. He said you wouldn't fight. He said you'd just cry and give up. He underestimated me. I said, the words tasting like victory. It seems you both did. A rather costly miscalculation, wouldn't you say? Costly? We're stuck here. The hotel bill is due. We have flights booked. He promised me. He promised. Her voice cracked, the bravado dissolving into a pathetic whine. So, the paradise was already showing its cracks. Good. Promises made on stolen foundations rarely hold up, Clarissa. I said, the detachment in my voice a carefully constructed shield. Inside, a complex mix of emotions churned. Vindication, yes, but also a lingering sadness for the life I had lost, for the man Mark had pretended to be. As for Mark, I imagine he'll be in touch with his lawyer. And his lawyer will be in touch with mine. That's how these things usually work when one party attempts grand larceny and gets caught with their hand in the proverbial cookie jar. But what are we supposed to do? She wailed. The we was particularly galling. That, Clarissa, I said, my voice hardening, is no longer my concern. You made your bed. Now you get to lie in it. Or, in this case, get kicked out of it when the bill isn't paid. I could almost hear her hyperventilating. Tell Mark, I added, a final, deliberate twist to the knife, that I hope he enjoys the local cuisine. I hear prison food is remarkably similar, regardless of the tropical location. I hung up, my hands steady. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of despair, or the silence of fear. It was the silence of a battle won, of a storm that had broken, leaving behind a clear, sharp dawn. He had screamed. The image replayed in my mind, not with malice, but with a sense of grim closure. He had tried to shatter my world, and in doing so, had only shattered his own. He had thought himself clever, invincible. He had forgotten one crucial thing. A woman scorned is formidable, but a woman fighting for her life, for her future, for her very solvency, armed with a good lawyer and a righteous fury, is a force of nature. The legal battle that followed was protracted and ugly, as divorces fueled by such profound betrayal often are. Mark, stripped of his ill-gotten gains and facing the full legal consequences of his actions, was a shadow of his former self. His arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a desperate, resentful anger. Clarissa, true to form, disappeared from his side the moment it became clear the lavish lifestyle he'd promised was built on sand, or rather, on frozen assets. She wasn't interested in a man facing financial ruin and potential fraud charges. Mr. Henderson was magnificent. He meticulously dismantled Mark's attempts to portray himself as a victim or to claim any legitimate right to the entirety of the funds he'd tried to abscond with. The frozen account became the centerpiece of the negotiations. Because the money was secured, because his attempt to hide it was so blatant, my leverage was immense. The settlement was far more favorable than I could have ever hoped for in the initial, dark days. I retained the house, a significant portion of our other shared assets, and, of course, the entirety of the life savings Mark had tried so desperately to steal. His grand plan to start a new life in luxury with his mistress had backfired spectacularly, leaving him with hefty legal bills, a tarnished reputation, and a future far bleaker than the one he had tried to condemn me to. There was no joy in his downfall, not really. Just a quiet, somber satisfaction. The victory was bittersweet.
I had won, yes.
I had reclaimed what was mine, and then some. I had ensured he faced the consequences of his actions. But the scars remained. The trust, once broken so catastrophically, could never be fully restored, not in the same innocent way. The 15 years we had shared were forever tainted, a landscape of memories now viewed through the lens of his ultimate betrayal. Rebuilding was a slow process. There were days when the ghost of what we'd had, or what I thought we'd had, haunted me. Days when the anger and hurt felt fresh. But there were also days filled with a new sense of purpose, of strength I hadn't known I possessed. I learned to manage my own finances, not with Mark's cautious pessimism, but with my own growing confidence. I reconnected with friends, building a support system based on genuine affection and mutual respect. The house, once a mausoleum of dead dreams, slowly began to feel like home again. My home. I painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, filled the spaces with things that brought me joy, things that were solely mine. The coastal cottage remained a dream, but now it was my dream, one I would work towards on my own terms, in my own time. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I think back to that moment in the kitchen, the shattered cup, the devastating realization. It feels like a lifetime ago, a scene from someone else's drama. The woman I was then, so trusting, so naive, is gone. In her place is someone stronger, warier, perhaps, but also more resilient. Someone who learned, in the crucible of betrayal, that she could not only survive but thrive. He screamed when the bank froze the transfer. That scream was the sound of his carefully constructed world imploding. It was the sound of his arrogance meeting reality. And in a strange way, it was the sound that finally set me free. He had tried to silence me, to erase me. Instead, he had given me a voice, a cause, and ultimately, a victory far greater than just the recovery of stolen money. It was the recovery of myself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for what's yours when the world tried to take it away, I'd love to hear your version in the comments below. Knowing we're not alone in these struggles, it's a powerful thing. Thanks for being here, for listening. Subscribing helps bring more of these stories to life, and I appreciate every single one of you.